My name is Martha Vance. I'm 68 years old, and for 11 years before I retired, I worked the reference desk at the county records office, which meant, for 11 years, my entire job was knowing exactly which document beats which other document, and where to find the one that matters before anyone else thinks to look for it. That Tuesday morning, I had two things sitting in a canvas tote bag on the back of my kitchen chair. One was a single sentence I was about to say to my daughter, calm as asking her to pass the salt. The other was a folder she had absolutely no idea existed, a folder that was about to make the lawyer standing in my kitchen, the one she'd paid for, apologize to her on his way out the door. Welcome back to MJ Revenge Stories, where every story starts with silence and ends with power. If you've ever had someone treat your quiet as an invitation instead of a warning, this one's for you. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. It started 40 days earlier, on an ordinary Saturday, with a front door I hadn't left unlocked. Character foundation: I spent 11 years at the county records office before I retired, cataloging deeds, liens, wills, and power of attorney filings for a living. It's not glamorous work. Most people picture a librarian. What I actually did most days was help strangers untangle exactly who owned what, and exactly what a piece of paper could and could not force them to do. I learned, over a decade, that most people are terrified of paperwork precisely because they've never bothered to read it slowly. I always read slowly. It was never a hurry for me, it was a habit, the same way some people twirl a pen or tap a foot. I'd sit at my kitchen table most evenings with a cup of chamomile tea, going line by line through whatever bill or notice had come that day, not because I needed to, but because it settled something in me. Elias, my husband, used to tease me about it. "You'd read the fine print on a birthday card, Martha," he'd say, and he wasn't wrong. I lost Elias 3 years ago, a heart attack sudden, on an ordinary Thursday morning while he was watering the same bougainvillea I still water today. We'd worked our whole lives for the quiet, comfortable stretch of years we thought we'd get together, the paid-off house on Larkspur Street, the modest but steady retirement savings, the garden he'd built terrace by terrace over 2 decades. He didn't get to enjoy much of it. I decided, somewhere in that first grieving winter, that I was going to enjoy it for both of us, quietly, on my own terms. I have 2 children. Julian, 36, married to a woman named Susan who has never once, in 9 years, asked me a question about my own life that didn't circle back to money. And Clara, 33, sharper than her brother, more direct, the one who inherited my stubbornness without inheriting my patience for reading the fine print first. For a while after Elias died, they were kind to me, genuinely, I think. Grief does strange things to a family. Sometimes it pulls people closer before it starts pulling at their patience for waiting on an inheritance. I noticed the shift about a year in. Small at first. Then this spring, it stopped being small. Inciting incident, it started with my front door standing open on a Saturday afternoon. I'd gone to the grocery store, 40 minutes, no more, and came home to find the door ajar, and Julian and Susan hauling cardboard boxes up my staircase, not one of them greeting me as I stood there with 2 paper bags cutting into my forearms. "Julian and I need to clear some space out of our apartment, Martha," Susan said. "Not stopping, not slowing. We're going to use the guest room to store a few things. You don't ever use it anyway. You don't ever use it anyway." 4 words, delivered like a fact instead of a request. And I would hear some version of that same sentence. "You don't need it. You don't use it. It's just sitting there," at least twice more before this story was finished. I stood at the bottom of my own staircase, holding my own groceries, in my own house, and said nothing. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. 30-some years of reading paperwork for a living had taught me one thing above all else: you never show your hand before you understand the whole table. I nodded. I went into the kitchen, I put away the groceries, and I started, quietly, keeping track. That guest room held my sewing machine, my mother's old rocking chair, and Elias's reading chair, the one with the worn left armrest where his elbow used to rest every evening. It was the last for me. It was the last room in the house that still smelled a little like him on cold mornings when the heat kicked on. Susan had looked right past all of that and seen square footage. The next morning, once they'd left for work, I found 8 cardboard boxes stacked floor to ceiling, blocking the window, crowding Elias's chair into a corner like it was an afterthought. I did not call Julian and scream. I did not cry over the boxes. I got the hand truck out of the garage, moved all 8 of them to the backyard, covered them with a tarp under the metal awning, and spent the rest of the morning cleaning the room and returning it to what it had been. When Julian came looking for paperwork in those boxes that evening, He found an empty room and came thundering down the stairs, panicked in a way that told me exactly how much he needed whatever was in box 4. "Mom, where's our stuff?" "Out back under the tarp," I said, not looking up from my book. "My house isn't a storage unit, Julian. If your apartment's too small, you'll need to rent one." He stood there with nothing to say. That was the moment I understood we weren't having a disagreement anymore. We were having a negotiation and only one of us knew it yet. 4. Backstory: why the rift happened. To understand how we got to 8 boxes in my guest room, you have to go back further to the year after Elias died, when I gave Clara an authorized user card on one of my accounts. It wasn't a large gesture in my mind. Clara had just moved for a new job. Her deposit and moving costs had wiped out her savings, and I told her, plainly, "This is for real emergencies, a flat tire, a bounced rent check, nothing else." She thanked me with what looked like real gratitude. For the first 8 months, she used it exactly as agreed. $40 here for a copay, $60 there for a car repair. I trusted the arrangement because she'd earned that trust. Then, this past spring, her definition of emergency began to drift. I noticed it the way I used to notice a misfiled deed, not all at once, but in a pattern that once you saw it you couldn't unsee. A boutique charge of $210. A $600 dinner at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of place Elias and I visited exactly twice in 31 years of marriage, both times for anniversaries. And then, in April, 2 round-trip plane tickets, not for Clara, but for her husband's parents, flown in for a visit Clara wanted to impress them with. I sat at my kitchen table with the statement in front of me, and my tea going cold, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not rage exactly. Grief, dressed up as anger. Because underneath the numbers, what I was really looking at was this. My daughter had quietly decided that my late husband's careful, decades-long savings existed to fund her image in front of her in-laws. And she hadn't thought once to ask whether that was something I could even afford, emotionally or otherwise, to give. I want to admit something here, the same way I'd want a stranger across a records desk to admit the real reason they were digging through an old file. It wasn't only principle that kept me from canceling that card the very night I found the charges. It was the quiet, unglamorous fear of being 31 years married and 3 years widowed and suddenly, functionally, alone. And some small, unproud part of me worried that if I pulled the money back, I'd be pulling my daughter back too, and I would rather have been used a little than have nobody call me mom at all. I sat with that fear for 4 days before I finally logged into the banking app and canceled the card. Not because the fear went away, because I decided, at 68, alone in a quiet kitchen, that being used wasn't actually company. It only looked like company from a distance. Internal conflict. I told my neighbor, Doreen, about the card the next morning over the fence between our gardens. Doreen's known me 22 years. She buried her own husband the year before I buried mine, and she doesn't sugarcoat much. "Martha, you've been telling yourself a story that if you just keep being generous, one day they'll come back around and actually see you," she said, snipping a dead rose off her bush without looking up. "That's not a plan. That's a hope you keep regifting to people who haven't earned it. They're my children, Doreen. They're adults who found out you have money and started acting like children who found out Christmas came early." She finally looked at me. "You keep letting this go because some part of you would rather be taken advantage of than be alone in that house. I understand it. I'm just telling you it's costing you more than the steakhouse dinner." I didn't answer her right away. I went inside, made myself tea, and sat with the accusation because it was true. And because being told the truth by someone who loves you is its own particular kind of ache. I decided, that afternoon, that I would keep doing exactly what I'd already started. Quietly, without confrontation, without lawyers, without a single raised voice, and see how far Clara and Julian were willing to go before they noticed the ground shifting under them. I proceeded anyway. Not because Doreen was wrong. Because I wanted, one last time, to see the full shape of what my children had become before I decided what to do about it. Stay with me, because what I built over the next 6 weeks, I built in the time most people spend deciding what to make for dinner. Rising microhooks, the credit card cancellation, didn't stay quiet for long. The very next afternoon, Clara called, breathless, furious. "Mom, I'm at the register at Nordstrom and my card isn't going through. It keeps saying error. Did you forget to pay the bill?" Not a question. A demand dressed as one. "The bill is fully paid, Clara," I said. watering my bougainvillea with the garden hose, the phone tucked against my shoulder. But the card is cancelled. I saw the plane tickets for your in-laws. Moving forward, if you want luxury, you can pay for it yourself. Mom, you can't do this to me. I'm standing right in front of the cashier. Of course I can. Use cash. I hung up. That was the first crack in what Clara had promised herself about how this arrangement was supposed to work. It would not be the last. Sunday dinners had, for years, been something I hosted without being asked. I cooked all morning, set the good table, and by 2 o'clock, Julian, Susan, and Clara would arrive, eat, criticize the food a little, stare at their phones, and leave me with a sink full of dishes. It had started, years ago, as something that felt like family. Lately, it had started to feel like a shift I'd never agreed to work. The Sunday after the card incident, I changed the terms without announcing it. I slept in. I read the paper. I made myself a small salad, ate alone at the kitchen table, and left the sink spotless by noon. At 2:30, they arrived expecting a full table and found bare, clean wood instead. "Where's dinner?" Susan asked, arms crossed, brows knit like I'd broken some standing law. "I already ate," I said from my armchair, not looking up from my book. "What are we supposed to eat?" Julian asked, genuinely bewildered, as though the concept of feeding himself had never crossed his mind before that exact moment. "I don't know," I said. "DoorDash, or the grocery store 2 blocks over. I just ask you wash whatever you use before you leave," Clara scoffed. "We always eat here on Sundays." I looked her dead in the eye. "My job was to raise you. You're adults in your 30s. I'm retired, and I'm nobody's maid." They slammed the door on their way out. It was, by that point, becoming a familiar sound. Here's where the story turns from irritation to something with real teeth. 3 nights later, I was in the guest room, checking on Elias's chair, which I'd moved back in after the tarp incident, and I found, half tucked under the seat cushion, Julian's phone, forgotten from a visit 2 days earlier. It buzzed while I was standing there. A text from Susan, previewed right there on the lock screen. No password needed for the first line to show. "Just talk to my cousin the notary. He says, if we get her to sign it before anyone questions her mental state, there's basically nothing anyone can challenge later. We need to move on this before she gets suspicious of the phone calls." I stood very still in that guest room, holding a phone that wasn't mine, reading a sentence about myself that I was never supposed to see. 31 years of marriage, 3 years of grief, and this, a plan, already in motion, to get me to sign away my own house before I got suspicious. I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it, under the cushion, and I did not confront anyone that night. I went downstairs, made myself tea, and sat at my kitchen table with the green ledger I still keep out of habit, and I began, for the first time, writing down dates. The bricks kept coming after that. Susan, at the next Sunday visit, which I did not host, though they came anyway, looked around my kitchen and said, not quite under her breath, "It's a lot of house for one person to rattle around in. Must get lonely." Julian, a few days later, standing in my driveway where he'd parked without asking. "Again, you know, Mom, it'd honestly be easier on everyone if you just let us help manage things before something happens." And then Clara, the sharpest brick of all, delivered on a Thursday evening when they showed up unannounced, sitting across from me with rehearsed pity in her voice. "Mom, we've noticed you've been acting really different lately. You're distant. You're making erratic decisions, canceling my card, skipping Sunday dinner. We honestly think this house is just too much for you to handle alone. It's a lot of responsibility for a woman your age. You don't need to carry all of this by yourself anymore. You don't need it." There it was, the second time, aimed straight at me in my own living room, dressed up as concern. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my mind or my memory. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out a small notepad, and wrote down the date, the time, and a bulleted summary of exactly what had just been proposed to me. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice suddenly less certain. "Taking notes," I said simply. "I like to keep track of who proposes what in this family." I told them, calmly, that my mind was perfectly sharp and the house was not for sale, and I excused myself to water my plants. I left them sitting in my living room, chewing on their own frustration, with no idea that the notepad in my pocket was now 4 pages deep, or that I already had a locksmith's number written on the very first line. The direct demand confrontation, the final act, came the following Tuesday morning, and Clara had clearly decided subtlety was no longer working. She walked into my kitchen with a man in a tight, light gray suit, carrying a leather portfolio like it was a weapon. He introduced himself as Mr. Harlan, family lawyer and notary. Clara didn't sit. She leaned both hands flat on my oak table, the way you lean on something when you want to look bigger than you are. "This is Mr. Harlan," she said. "He's a family lawyer and a notary. We brought a power of attorney document for you to sign, Mom. It gives us full administrative control. Julian and I are taking over your accounts and the sale of this house before you lose it all, because you can't manage things anymore." Mr. Harlan slid the document across the table with a look of bored, practiced pity. "Mrs. Vance, it's very straightforward. Your children just want to protect the family estate. Sign this, and we avoid a lengthy public process where they'd have to formally prove cognitive decline. Refuse, and they may have no choice but to pursue that process instead." A threat dressed in a lawyer's calm. I let the silence sit. 1 second, 2, 3, 4 full seconds of nothing but the tick of the kitchen clock and the smell of my own coffee going cold in front of me. I watched Clara's confidence flicker right around the 3rd second, the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere in the house. Thinking in pen hover, unsure whether to offer it or wait. Then I set my mug down, gently, on its saucer. "You brought a lawyer into my kitchen to threaten me, Clara," I said. How theatrical. The reveal turn, I reached into the canvas tote bag hanging off the back of my chair and pulled out my own folder, thin, unremarkable looking, and about to be the heaviest thing in that room. "I'm afraid my daughter has wasted your morning, Mr. Harlan," I said. "She has no idea what I've spent the last month documenting. She's just triggered the exact situation I've been preparing for." Clara's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? Mom, stop making things up and just sign. Sit down," I said, and something in my voice, not loud, not sharp, just absolutely certain, made both of them obey without another word. I slid 2 documents across the table, pushing their power of attorney paperwork aside like it was yesterday's mail. "First," I said, tapping the bank letterhead, "this is confirmation of my new financial structure. I moved the majority of my savings into an irrevocable lifetime annuity 3 weeks ago. There is no savings account left to manage. There is no principal balance to withdraw. Pays me a fixed monthly amount for the rest of my life. When I'm gone, what remains goes to a local animal rescue. There is no lump sum here for anyone to touch." Clara's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Mr. Harlan reached for the paper, skimmed it fast, professional habit overriding his surprise, and gave a slow, grim nod that told Clara everything she needed to know before he said a word. "Second," I continued, sliding the thicker document forward, heavy with seals and notary stamps. "This is the lease agreement for the upstairs of this house. I've rented the entire 2nd floor to a young couple, both doctors, both lovely, for the next 3 years. I sealed off the internal staircase. They access their unit from an external stairway. The lease includes an occupancy clause. Any attempt by a relative to enter that space voids the lease and triggers a financial penalty against whoever caused the breach." I looked directly at her. "This house is legally and commercially committed for the next 3 years, Clara. You cannot sell it. You cannot divide it. And if you set foot upstairs to harass my tenants, the police will remove you for trespassing, at their request, not mine." Mr. Harlan stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He snapped his portfolio shut. "You told me this property was unencumbered, and her funds were sitting in a liquid checking account," he said to Clara, not bothering to hide his irritation. "There's nothing here to manage. This power of attorney is useless." He tried the door on his way out, my new deadbolt, installed the previous Friday, sticking for half a second before it gave, and left without another word. The second small failure of his morning, stacked right on top of the first. Clara sat frozen, then found her voice, and it came out cracked. It's our inheritance. It's what Dad left for us. Your father left it to me, I said, lifting my coffee mug. It had gone lukewarm, and it tasted, somehow, like exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. I don't owe you my house, my savings, or my silence, Clara. I never did. Clara stood there a moment longer, hunting for some new angle, some crack in the practical armor I'd spent 40 days building. There wasn't one. No lawsuits to file. No lump sum to fight over. No cognitive decline case to make against a woman who'd just outmaneuvered a licensed attorney at her own kitchen table. You're going to end up entirely alone, Mom, she hissed on her way out. Julian and I are never setting foot in this house again. Make sure the gate clicks behind you, I said, and didn't look up. The months that followed were quieter than any I'd had since Elias died. And quiet, it turns out, is not the same thing as lonely, though it took me a while to trust the difference again. Julian called twice in the first 6 weeks. Short calls, awkward ones. Neither of us quite sure what to say without Susan or Clara in the room. Clara didn't call at all. Word got back to me, through Doreen, that Susan's cousin, the notary who'd apparently helped plan the timing of the whole thing, had done something similar with another elderly relative the year before. And that family was now in the middle of an ugly legal fight I was grateful, every single day, not to be part of. The upstairs tenants, Priya and her husband, turned out to be exactly as lovely as the leasing agent had promised. We crossed paths in the garden most weekends. They brought me pastries from the bakery on Ridgeline Avenue. I sent up lemons from the tree Elias planted the year we bought the house. Small, uncomplicated kindnesses traded without an agenda, which had become, without my quite noticing, the thing I'd missed most. The quieter moment, the one that actually undid me, came about 2 months later. I was cleaning out a closet and found a card Elias had written me the year before he died, tucked inside an old recipe box I hadn't opened since the funeral. In his careful, slightly slanted handwriting, he'd written, "You've spent your whole life reading the fine print for other people. Don't forget to read it for yourself too, Martha. You deserve the same protection you give everyone else." I sat on the closet floor and cried. Not about Clara, not about the lawyer, not about the money at all. About how long it had taken me to finally take my own husband's advice, and how glad I was that I'd finally listened before it cost me everything instead of just some boxes and a canceled credit card. Blood makes someone family, but respect is what earns them a place in your life. And I spent 40 quiet days making sure mine could no longer be taken without it. That's my story. If it meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me. I read every one. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe to MJ Revenge Stories, because there's another one waiting for you next week.